All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful coffee break. I think I'm on cup number 4, so hopefully you all are as recaffeinated as I am. But let's jump right back into it. Our next panel will discuss sustainable labor practices and the financial materiality of social value and how to measure it. For this conversation, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Delilah Rothenberg, co-founding partner and executive director for Predistribution Initiative. She brings 2 decades of experience in finance across asset classes and now leads a multi-stakeholder nonprofit designed to co-create improved investment structures and practices that share more wealth and influence with workers and communities, a practice near and dear to my heart. So please join me in welcoming Delilah and her panelists with a round warm of applause. Hand of applause.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay? Is this mic on? Okay, wonderful. Really, thank you all for being here and for your interest in this really important topic. Thank you to Tanzi and Allison and the team at NYU, and congrats on the amazing progress with the tools that you're developing. I can see the audience and their responsiveness and their excitement about the usefulness of this all. So really exciting to be here. Again, my name is Delilah Rothenberg, co-founder and executive director of the Predistribution Initiative. I believe I have a couple of colleagues here as well, Amanda Feldman, who is a co-founder of the Predistribution Initiative, as well as Dmitry Yoselovich, who works with 17 Communications. And we have an amazing panel who, since I worked in private equity, have been learning from about different issues when it comes to human capital and responsible social practices and the value of doing that. I should also mention that the Predistribution Initiative is a member of a working group that's working to launch a task force on inequality and social-related financial disclosures. So maybe that will come up in this session as well. I noticed that in the past sessions, particularly on climate, we had a lot of acronyms and a lot of different frameworks. And I don't think we have so many in social, and I'm not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I think we'll discuss that. So with that, I would like to introduce our panelists, and I'll give you each an opportunity to introduce yourselves as well. I'll just name you first. Shiva Rajgopal from Columbia Business School, Diana Proper de Diana. It's always hard for me to say the last part of Diana's last name. From Cranemere, Tom Woelfel from HCAP Partners, and Dan Pedrotty from the North America Building Trades Union. So with that, do you have a mic, Shiva? You do. Okay. Do you want to each quickly introduce yourself and cover what you work on?
Yeah, hi. So I'm I'm the cheap date. I'm the professor uptown at Columbia. Thank you for having me. So my day job is that of an accounting professor. Off late, I've been interested in how, what we teach in a high school economics textbook is virtually impossible to implement for our trillion-dollar companies because we don't know any source of how the value is actually created. In the context of labor, barely 15% of US companies actually even tell you about labor costs. 15%. The other 85 do not. So for an Amazon or a Microsoft, I don't even know how much they spend on compensation. So my big message is going to be, we need a bit more of a record keeping of the basic stuff before we even begin to manage what we intend to achieve and all the other great things that people like to do in terms of value add, in terms of reducing turnover, in terms of treating employees as partners, and so on.
Thanks, Shiva. And Diana?
Great. Thank you also for having me. And I also have learned a lot from Delilah over the years. So thank you. So I'm Diana Proper, and I'm a managing director at Cranemere. And we're a little bit of a different kind of investor in private companies. Number one, we are structured as a holding company. So we buy, build, and hold for the long term. So unlike a private equity fund, we have no structural necessities to sell our businesses. We have 7 operating companies, the oldest of which is 9 years old. It probably would have been sold twice, at least twice, in a private equity structure. Thankfully, we have able to support the company's growth throughout the last almost 10 years. A really important part of what we do is focusing on how we can leverage business as a force for good. We believe that essentially if you are a leader, if you're a company and you're a leader in both environmental and social impact, you will outperform your peers over the long term. And our long-term structure enables us to make investments in the environment and in our workforce, which we'll be talking about, which much deeper investments with longer paybacks that we would have been able to do in a short-term structure. And I would argue that long-termism is essential to what we're talking about today. We believe that investment in workforce is positive outcomes for the workers means positive outcomes for shareholders. And I also think we have a long ways to go. I think we've realized that, the last 5 to 6 years with the polarization, the COVID, George Floyd, political elections, that there is a tremendous amount of social discontent still in this country, and it's really been a wake-up call, I think, to everyone, to Cranemere, to other investors, about what are we going to do to address these social problems that are felt so widespread among the American worker, and what opportunities exist to fix that.
Great. Hey everyone, I'm Tom Woelfel, Senior Director of Impact for HCAP Partners. We're an impact fund focused on market rate return based in San Diego, California. And we provide mezzanine debt and private equity to companies in the lower middle market, so companies between 10 to 100 million in annual revenue. And what makes us an impact investor is we are focused squarely on advancing job quality within our portfolio companies over the investment period. And we've developed something called the gainful jobs approach that combines a quantitative measurement system with ongoing active engagement with our portfolio companies. So for us, we believe that investing in workers is not only the right thing to do and a way to be having positive impact, but ultimately it's a key value creation driver for us in terms of achieving the business objectives we hope to achieve with the companies and ultimately generating returns. So for us, we just see job quality as good business sense.
And I'm Dan Pedrotty. I am Director of Capital Strategies, North America's Building Trades Unions, and Senior Advisor at Omidyar Network. As a self-professed labor union hack, I think I'm a little bit of an exotic species in this room, but on the LP side. So the North America's Building Trades Unions are a federation of 14 different unions with 3 million members in the US and Canada. I work on the pension fund side, so in many ways, Brad Lander's speech beforehand was a really helpful setup to the work we're doing, in that our members' time horizon as deferred wages and workers' capital is generational. So we're long-term patient capital. There's about $770 billion in multi-employer defined benefit pension plans that our members can take with them from job to job as gig economy workers in construction, men and women. So I'm going to talk about our work in private equity and lifting up labor standards, working closely with big public pension funds like CalPERS, investment consultants, and a few asset managers as well, and look forward to the conversation.
Great, thanks so much. So this panel focuses on this idea that a lot of companies, I'll get that later. No, thank you though. But a lot of companies consider human capital to be their greatest asset, and they talk about that a lot. But I think we all recognize that in the United States and in many places around the world, human capital is very undervalued, and returns to labor have not been increasing in tandem with returns to capital, returns to executives. So we talked a little bit about this on our preparatory discussion. Why is this the case? And I think, Dan, why don't we start with you from a labor perspective and an LP perspective? And I'll also just say, by the way, after those introductions, I hope you all realize what an amazing diverse set of perspectives we have on this panel. We have labor, we have the LP perspective, we have a GP, an impact GP perspective, we have an investor who's with a holding company doing private equity investing, and we have an academic with an accounting background. So really, really interesting to hear from everybody, pretty much on almost every question that we're going to cover. So Dan, what's the issue here? Why is social capital so undervalued?
Well, I think the S is hard, right? I mean, I think the E and the G are maybe easier to translate. The S is difficult. But for us on the union side, it really started with work in real assets. So we started pressing labor rights through pension funds like Comptroller Lander, New York Common, Oregon, where they started bringing labor protections, freedom to organize, freedom of association into their real asset portfolio through responsible contractor policies, insisting that as LPs that these terms apply. And that led to things like with Carlyle, for instance. I know Carlyle was mentioned in the last panel. On the building trade side, we actually partnered with Carlyle through a union-owned asset management firm called Ulico to co-invest in rebuilding Terminal 1 at JFK. So we were able to both bring our capital and our workforce in, our apprentices, being able to train people and bring a diverse workforce to the job site, to a huge project. So with Carlyle, we had a fee aggregation agreement for a fund that they were raising money for. We had the responsible contractor policy, and we had co-investment at JFK Terminal 1. That led to now a labor management committee that we have with the American Investment Council and a number of other firms like Carlyle, KKR, Blackstone, and TPG. So I think we're still early on in this fight, in this effort. And the way forward is exactly what the controller was saying, and that there is an upsurge, as I think most people in this room know, in labor organizing, in strikes, in young people joining unions, in the need to see more of a backbone for the middle class and collective bargaining and raising wages and living standards. So I think as we get into that and figure out things like freedom of association, we see what's going on, in terms of the Starbucks fight, and maybe a change in course there. We see at Microsoft freedom of association. So workers right now, this week, are organizing through their own voice and autonomy around things like their role vis-a-vis AI. And we see worker rights emerging from crises too. I mentioned Blackstone. So Blackstone's portfolio company, Packer Sanitation, agreed to a freedom of association framework for workers to organize when they had to, Packer Sanitation had to pay a record fine for employing children in their workforce at meat processing plants. So it was over 102 kids from 13 to 17 who were working overnight. And this was in 13 plants in 7 states around the country. So however we get there is going to be the kind of the challenge, but I think we're starting to see more there in terms of labor rights. And I'll talk more a little bit later about how we're working with pension funds to bring this as LPs as well.
Thanks, Dan. And Shiva, before we go to the investor perspective, what are you seeing in your research in terms of how labor is valued versus other inputs into the production process?
So I don't mean to claim that accounting solves every problem, but it solves a lot of problems. So if something's not on the balance sheet, people don't treat it as an asset. So this is the same issue with R&D. The auditors don't worry about valuation. We just go with historical cost. If stuff is expensed, so it's a conservative way of reporting, so you won't get sued. So the system as a whole, sadly, I think is set up to almost not value labor as an asset. And it starts with what you count and how you count. So that's one comment. The second comment, data is incredibly difficult. It just blows my mind that I don't know the compensation costs of, say, most of the the large public U.S. companies. So how does one even begin to put some data science, rigor, discipline thinking into any of this, right? We've tried a little bit. I'll give you just a very quick example. So simple thing you could do is this idea of opportunity cost. So let's say you're a worker at Apple and you're getting, the median pay is $220 or $250K or something, right? That's all I can observe from the outside because I can just see median pay because of the CEO pay issue. And let's say the next best alternative that this person has is a job that fetches this person $150K. So think of maybe 230 minus 150, 80K as the value that Apple adds to the employee, as an employee value add. And then if you think about a simple reductionist model where let's say the only factor of production is labor, and you start plotting, say, shareholder value add, which we've done for years, right? EVA, some version thereof, with employee value add. Interestingly, I mean, if this were truly a participative economy, you would expect to find a lot of firms on the diagonal, meaning if shareholder value add goes up 10%, does the value that the employer adds to the employee go up by 10%? It turns out, by and large, the data is a flat line. Labor is effectively treated like a bond, meaning the value add, even in tech companies, by the employer to the employee, by and large is constant. and the payoff arguably goes to the shareholders, right? And this is not meant to be good or bad. I'm just trying to understand the data. So who shows up on the diagonal? Banks, because banks have a pretty robust bonus culture. So as the trading income goes up, the employees get paid more. Some of the unionized shops show up closer to the diagonal. Costco shows up closer to the diagonal. So we don't even, we need to have all this data publicly available, open source, before we can even have, discussions about who's doing a good job managing labor versus not. So the rhetoric in this area is way ahead of the data and the disclosures. That's the complaint about ESG in general. I'll stop there and then we can talk more if you like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I want to come back to this this point, especially that you just raised about the banks being different. But we'll get to that in a minute. Diana and Tom, what do you think from your perspectives as investors? From my experience, when I was an investor, there definitely seemed to be a resistance to freedom of association and collective bargaining. There also was, I don't know if it was a resistance, but a number of bottlenecks, certainly, to getting more data from the private equity space. And maybe there are some other challenges that you're seeing from your perspectives as well. So curious what your thoughts are, reflecting on both what Dan and Shiva said, and as well as from your own experiences.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the status quo that we find ourselves in is just pure inertia. As I think about private equity overall, the industry has been successful in terms of the status quo of the way that workers have been valued and the practices that have been implemented within portfolio companies. So, I do think there are certain kind of enabling conditions that need to happen in order to kind of shift that calculus. And sure, data is one of those pieces, but I don't necessarily think that is one of the major impediments. And I'm, from kind of a green shoots perspective in terms of where we find ourselves in this moment, I am heartened by some of the efforts from a data standpoint, whether it be within the impact investing industry around aligning around job quality metrics to the work of the GIN and IRIS Plus, who did a consultation with the ILO to establish some kind of basic impact KPIs around job quality. Or if I think at a more macro level, the efforts of the Department of Labor in partnership with the Families and Workers Fund through the Job Quality Measurement Initiative to be thinking about how can we not just be thinking about the unemployment rate in the US, but how do we think about the underlying quality of the jobs that we're seeing in the US? And how do we bridge the gap between data that BLS and others are tracking versus the private sector, and just be able to say more about the state of the American worker? So I think that macro data is going to go a long ways to helping us in private equity better understand kind of what are the different economies that we find ourselves working in and our companies working in. Beyond that, I think there's a big societal recognition that has happened over the last few years with COVID, with the Great Resignation becoming the Great Reshuffling of the value of workers and the importance of workers in delivering the goods and services that we depend on day in, day out. And so, I think that narrative shift also gives us a lot of momentum as part of thinking through more how workers can be centered in our value creation efforts as a private equity industry.
Yeah, so I've got a lot to say about what you all said. I think, number one, I totally agree that the S, worker engagement, pay, all of those issues, everything is hard. It's much harder, and it's messy, and, the environment doesn't speak. So whenever, you have people trying to solve problems together, it's always a little bit harder. I think the fact that one of the big differences in the environment, which I think is changing today for the social side, is climate especially is viewed as an existential threat now to political, economic, and social stability. It's here, we see it, we see storms, droughts, etc. I think one of the big things that's changed in the last 5 years, especially with COVID and all the polarization and all the disenfranchisement that you read about, and income inequality and wealth disparity, is I think in the private sector it's finally being seen as an existential threat to political, social, and economic stability. And so we're all taking a hard look in the mirror and saying, wow, we have normalized a lot of practices to reduce labor costs. That has been the singular focus, whether it's globalization and offshoring jobs, whether it's outsourcing to get rid of full-time jobs to temporary jobs, technology replacing jobs. All of those things have become normalized to all of us. You know, we get trained in that stuff in business school, accounting too. No offense. So, but I think now we're at a point where, because of this existential threat and realization, there is a huge opportunity now, just as there has been with climate, to turn this into an opportunity of how do we change the rules of the game so that we're focusing on how to invest instead of divest in people, and how much value that does create. Because we know it creates value. It's common sense. When you say you pay people more, you treat them well, you manage their health care costs, you help them pay for their health care costs, they're going to perform better, they're going to be happier. All of those things seem like common sense, but we've gotten so far away from the common sense because of all of the practices and the policies and the accounting practices and priorities that have been normalized.
Thanks, Diana. So it sounds like from what you're saying, there's both a system level materiality case as well as a single financial materiality case for addressing the S in ESG. In this context, we're talking about labor, of course, but similar to what Comptroller Brad Lander said earlier, he said he's a universal owner, that the New York City retirement systems, they're exposed to nearly every industry, geography, and asset class, and so they're exposed to system level risks like climate change and inequality, which can negatively affect their diversified portfolios. They can't diversify that away. And I think, we're all probably very familiar with the idea that there's single financial materiality, which is what's the risk and return to an individual investment in our portfolio too. So it sounds like there's an argument to be made for both. Does everybody on the panel generally agree there? One of the challenges that I have with this concept, we're a big believer in that. One of the challenges that we've encountered in our discussions with LPs is this question of, well, when is this risk going to hit our portfolios and by how much? Any thoughts from the panel on how to address this question?
So can I pick a smaller piece of that puzzle? So the labor cost point, right? So the claim's often made, perhaps correctly, that wages have been stagnating. And we've had this conversation. But if you plot the employer cost of labor, not what the employee sees, it's a 45-degree line. So what's grabbing that triangle? Healthcare. So if the ESG movement wants to be mad at somebody, be mad at healthcare.
And how do we get that message out? Do people not understand that because of the data transparency issue?
I think so. I mean, so I've never heard this argument being framed the way I'm trying to frame it. If you're seeing wages getting stagnated, guess what? The system's actually skimming out a lot. We have the trifecta of healthcare, pharma, doctors, and insurance companies. That's the only industry where earnings are going up 10 to 12% a year.
Reflections from the other panelists?
Well, first of all, I think we do have the data. We just need to look at it. I think what is workforce retention in our companies? What is productivity? What is the level of engagement? Sometimes there are problems or there are issues or areas of improvement, but we're not asking the questions and we're not really probing, the data that is right in front of us. And I think it's a matter of, for us, part of it has been engaging with our CEOs and the executive leadership team to try to find, to answer the question, like if you have this high turnover, let's say in one of our companies, what can we do about it? What are some of the underlying causes? And you'd be surprised that not every company is necessarily focusing on these things, right? We then try to suggest solutions, but then what's really important is for them to actually track if you do raise pay or you do increase benefits. And this is another area where we're trying to really improve, is how do you actually track then the correlation, not the correlation, the causation, because we have too much correlated data. What we need is causation data between increased pay, increased benefits, and financial security activities that we might be doing, and how does that impact turnover, retention, productivity, and being able to attract the best workforce. So I think the data is there. We just have to focus on it.
One other thing I'll add. So we're approaching this both from the investor side as pension capital, as workers' capital, but also from the workforce side too. So, typically if you talked about the construction unions 50 years ago, you talk about, predominantly white, predominantly male. Well, we're majority minority now in most big cities. We have apprenticeship readiness programs on military bases, in prisons, bringing a diverse workforce into the apprenticeship system and training them in the union trades. And I came from a conference last weekend that's now the biggest conference in the building trades, called Tradeswomen Build. It was 5,000 women. 80% of the population was 80% of the conference was women. It was 50% people of color. So we're diversifying, but we also have to make our value proposition in terms of like what are the outcomes when we spend $2 billion a year with our signatory employers on training on 1,900 training centers around the country. So much like the comptroller had a couple of studies he pointed to, there was a recent independent, very rigorous study that looked at a range of labor metrics on union versus non-union, because we put a premium on training, and someone in many cases has to go through a training program for 5, 6, 7 years in order to become a journey person. So just 4 data points on productivity, total cost, labor shortages, and turnover from this independent study: union versus non-union labor. Productivity for union labor is 14% higher versus open shop. The use of union labor reduces the total cost of projects by an average of 4% because of turnover and productivity in particular. Projects are 40% less likely to experience a shortage of skilled labor. This is a big deal for us in terms of the hiring hall and providing labor for the JFK project when union labor is sourced versus open shop. And then turnover is 1/3 less in union labor versus non-union. So part of what we have to do when we talk to big private equity firms, to project owners, is make the case not just around the people who show up, but the value add they bring. And that's our fiduciary case when we press for labor protections like project labor agreements in many cases.
That's great. Thanks, Dan. And, was that data that's on public companies?
This is on union versus non-union projects around the U.S. So it's all public and private construction and big projects.
Yeah, I think that one of the concerns I hear from academics when we talk about trying to produce research that shows not just correlations but causation is that the data isn't there to do the empirical analysis, and that the GPs and the investors aren't willing to share the data. And I just think that that's a really interesting observation to share with the audience. And I don't know if anybody wants to dig into it more, but it does seem to be a major challenge with, when we think about social issues in private equity, that we don't necessarily have the data there. Maybe internally you're able to do the analysis, which, Diana, it sounds like you might be working to do, and other investors. I don't know, Tom, if you're also working to do that. But I think for outside analysis, it's difficult.
Yeah, I'll say, we're still waiting on rulemaking from the SEC around human capital management reporting disclosure, which I think will impact private equity in terms of setting, some minimum data points that private equity will be looking to report on. And, from my perspective at HCAP, we, for every investment we're making, we are doing a really detailed analysis of job quality, both during due diligence and then on an ongoing basis, at least twice a year throughout the investment period, to really understand what does job quality look like at different moments in time, and then using that data and kind of analysis as a feedback loop with our companies so we can identify opportunities to be engaging with them to enhance their workplace practices in ways that are going to really kind of meet where they are. So from where I sit, that is just another way that we work with our companies from a value creation standpoint. Yes, we're an impact fund, but I think a lot of the strategies and the ways we're working with kind of helping our companies systematize human capital management is just good business sense. And so I do think, the data piece is something that private equity firms can get from their portfolio companies if they ask. They can, write it into their investment docs like we do. And there are kind of good standards, frameworks out there that PE can leverage as part of identifying what you should be kind of asking your companies about and engaging them around. So, and one basic example is we track living wage data with all of our portfolio companies. So we collect data on the wages that all of our portfolio companies' employees are being paid. We understand kind of generally where those employees live. And then we compare that to the MIT living wage calculator. So we're able to understand at any given point in time what percentage of our employees are earning a living wage sufficient to provide for themselves as well as to provide for a partner or spouse and one child. And we use that data as an engagement tool with our portfolio companies. And a lot of our companies don't understand that their frontline workers are not earning a wage that's sufficient to be providing for themselves and their families. And that creates a lot of financial stress for that particular worker. And the research shows that when folks are experiencing financial stress, it actually affects your productivity and your way to be present on the job. So again, like some really basic data points that are not that hard to leverage, I think are very doable among private equity firms.
Yeah, I would concur. We do an analysis on environmental and social externalities post acquisition of a business, everything from carbon emissions, waste, toxicity, land use, and on the social side, diversity, wage quality, health, career advancement, things like that. And so we are looking at wage quality, insofar as who is making a living wage, who is not. And I think one of the things I realized, having been in this industry for a really long time and liking to call myself an impactful investor, is I think very few of us actually do that analysis of figuring out in our portfolio or operating companies of the workforce, of the lower paid workforce and the hourly paid workforce, who is making at least a living wage. Because if you don't know the information, you don't know the data, you can't act on it. And we totally agree that if you're not making a living wage and you're financially insecure, you are not going to be 100% focused at work. You will not be giving 100% of that discretionary effort to your job. So it makes common sense, but it's going to pay off to make them financially secure. And that's just kind of the baseline here. We're not talking about beyond that, which we can.
One more question on data, related to data before we move on, which is sometimes when I say, oh, more data would be helpful on social issues, there's actually a frequent question that comes up with reference to the executive, the CEO to median pay ratio disclosure. And people say, well, now that's being disclosed and the ratio has just gotten worse. Or some people say, well, that's being disclosed, but it incentivizes a company to outsource more of its labor because maybe it's only capturing, full-time employees versus contracted workers as well. And so, so I was just curious, what's going wrong here?
Well, I think the SEC burned far too much political capital coming up with that disclosure, which is of limited value. I wish I knew something about the 200,000 employees minus the top 5. There's almost too much disclosure about the top 5 with its attendant. So once you have, we have a enforcement mechanism that effectively asks for a lot of disclosure. So you get a lot of disclosure. So if you read these so-called CDNAs, the compensation discussion analysis section, 60, 70 pages. You need to be a forensic detective to really figure out what's going on. So how do you deal with the outrage constraint the public has? You make it sound as though it's pay for performance. So any proxy statement you pick, they'll say 80% of our CEO's pay is at risk. If 80% of my pay was at risk, I wouldn't show up to work. Does anybody believe that? But having said all that, forget that. I personally think the SEC really wasted a lot of political capital just worrying about that as opposed to the rest. And if you're waiting for the SEC's rule to solve anything, you'll be deeply disappointed. At best, they'll put some very basic stuff in as a political compromise because it's an election year. So this has to be a voluntary effort, by and large. It has to be a coalition of people getting together. And the CEO median pay thing, what can you say? What can you say? Because, for example, if you look at Apple, the median worker is like very different. There are these genius bar people who are probably not geniuses, or at least not paid like that. And there are these other guys who are probably the real geniuses who are probably paid millions. What does median even tell me? I need a distribution. The median worker is like highly unrepresentative of the real worker, depending on the business model you have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So.
But I think in the private equity realm, private ordering will lead to maybe a new standard. So I mentioned this at the outset. CalPERS in September adopted these set of labor principles across their private equity portfolio, right, which is like 73, 74 billion for CalPERS. New York City is doing the same thing, meeting with managers now about the core labor rights, like the freedom to organize, the right to collectively bargain, the ILO standards that Lander referenced as well. So we have asset owners moving now, Illinois as well. We have investment consultants asking these questions in their DDQ, Makita, Hamilton Lane, Siegel Marco, and we have a few asset managers moving as well. Hamilton Lane also an asset manager, and a firm called Bernhard Capital as well. So we're starting with, much like on the real asset side, we're starting with the private ordering asset owners to raise the bar, and then bring the coalition of the willing along. And I think that's a lot of what the folks in this room are thinking about and wrestling with as well.
Yeah, and Dan, is there a way that people in the audience can find the NAB2 principles that you have developed?
They're on our website, nab2.org. But the easiest thing is my email is just dan@nab2.org if you'd like to see them. The ones on our website were adopted by the Electrical Workers Union, one of our biggest unionized pension funds. But like I mentioned, CalPERS, New York City, and Illinois, and that'll be growing as well. But you'll see under the Capital Strategies tab on the NAB2 website a copy of their principles around not just core labor rights, but things like fair wages and benefits, diversity, and really kind of the full scope of what the S really should mean in terms of the portfolio company.
Yeah, those principles are really important because at the Predistribution Initiative, a motto that we really buy into that was actually from the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. And so I think it's very difficult for many of us as private sector players, investors, or companies to come up with solutions for how to address workers' problems or communities' problems if we don't actually engage them. And so the NAB2 principles were developed with the input of labor. And so, I think that's really part of the value of freedom of association and collective bargaining as well, is you'll get more effective solutions when you're actually engaging with labor and hearing from workers and the representatives themselves. There are some solutions that are starting to emerge in the private equity space that are gaining a lot of enthusiasm around, for instance, sharing equity ownership with workers. And the Economic Policy Institute has some data that they recently came out with showing that since 1978, CEO pay has risen over 1,000 times, whereas worker pay has risen by less than 1,000%, excuse me, versus worker pay, which has increased less than 20%. And so when you think about that, I mean, there's probably a number of reasons why, but part of it is the structure of pay, right? The executives are compensated in equity or equity-linked compensation, and workers don't necessarily usually have that kind of benefit. I think, Shiva, that goes to your point about the banks, right? They have a bonus culture, maybe there's profit sharing, equity ownership. And so curious about everybody's perspective on the potential of worker ownership solutions, their potential upside, some of the risks that we should be mindful of as this gains in popularity. I don't know who wants to start. I know, Diana, you've spent a lot of time thinking about this.
It's my cold call. Yeah, so we, and you know about this, we've engaged over the last year and a half on what I call a learning journey in terms of really with income inequality and wealth disparity coming to the forefront and having a massive spotlight showed on it, starting in COVID. We asked ourselves a question, do we have problems in our own companies and how we think about this? Is there more we can be doing? And so we embarked on this journey, talked to Delilah, talked to Good Jobs Institute, talked to Financial Health Network, Pete Stavros, Ownership Works. A lot of people know these organizations. And I think what we came up with is trying to look at this holistically, because there's there's your near-term needs as a worker, and again, now I'm talking about the lower paid workforce and the hourly workforce. And then there's long-term wealth accumulation. And so our principles really are around addressing immediate worker financial security. And that has to do with, pay, living wage, and benefits so that you're able to pay for your basic cost of living, right? So these are things now that we're kind of codifying and formalizing and will be rolling out. But we're still in this sort of development phase. Not that we haven't done some of this, but we're really trying to develop our own framework going forward for what this means. Secondly, it's really about, to your question about listening to labor, we don't know what labor wants, what workers want and need at the different companies. We've got industrial businesses, manufacturing, service, everybody, different locations, so people have different needs. So one of our principles is basically listening and learning, and talking directly, making engagement and speaking with, whether it's employee engagement, surveys, or other tools that we're thinking about, but actually listening and responding to worker voices and making sure that we're implementing things based on the recommendations. And what we've also learned is it has to become part of manager compensation, that they are responding to what is transparently shared in that feedback, all the way up the chain. And then the last thing is wealth accumulation. We definitely believe that all workers in companies should benefit from the value creation that they are a part of making happen. So, but that's a long-term thing, and it can't happen without education, investment help. All the financial education that comes with that. But the whole thing's got to be holistic, because people care about how they're going to pay for the next meal or the school bill or the car breaking down before they can care about the equity ownership, which might have a payoff in 5 years.
Yeah, completely agree with what Diana shared. We see ownership as one piece of the puzzle in terms of creating quality jobs for employees. But, as much as we like to think we're fantastic investors, there's no guarantee at the end of the day that we're going to have a successful exit that will result in a wealth creation event for workers where they have ownership. So it's really critical that we are meeting employees, workers, where they are in their day-to-day needs, with living wages, with health insurance that they can afford where they're having to pay the premium, and with other mechanisms for building wealth, whether that's kind of emergency savings or retirement benefits. So yeah, I think ownership is fantastic. The work of ownership works. We're big fans of at HCAP. But we really see it as just kind of one of the pieces that we need to be focusing on in order to really shift the discussion around workers and ultimately deliver better outcomes for them.
And Tom, I also, part of what you and Diana just talked about reminded me that I don't think a lot of investors actually know what a living wage means. Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. The way you can think about a living wage is it is the wage that you need to be able to really just buy basic goods and services for yourself. So to be able to afford food on the table, to be able to afford gas in your car, all the things that you would need just to get by, not expenses for entertainment. It doesn't take into account that in terms of the living wage calculator that MIT has created. So it really is, it's not a subsistence wage, but it's what folks need at a bare minimum level to get by. And you would be surprised as you look at what the living wage is according to different geographies around the US, how high that wage is just for someone to be able to make ends meet. And the other really neat thing about the living wage calculator is it enables you to change the family composition for an individual worker, so you can understand what is the wage that would be needed to provide for one individual, or what would be the wage needed to provide for an individual with 3 children and a spouse.
Yeah, and you can enter with the MIT living wage calculator, you can do it, you just enter the zip code, literally, of the United States, and it will come up what that living wage is. And again, that doesn't include vacations or entertainment. It's basically paying for your rent, your housing, health care, things like that.
Shiva just whispered to me. Here, go ahead. No, no, go, no.
Well, I was going to say that in New York it's 55,000. Does everybody here get a living wage? I hope. But here's just to kind of insert at least a little bit of a boundary condition, right? So this is not so the market for lower level workers is reasonably efficient, right? So there is X amount that an employer is willing to pay, and there are substitutes. So if you substitute equity with cash, that number is not going to go up magically, right? So how does one solve that problem is the question to think about, right? I will give you an example. Whole Foods, maybe a crude example, but works. Whole Foods was fantastic to its workers, but it turns out that their productivity was probably half of that of Kroger's, which was a unionized shop. And eventually what happened to Whole Foods? Product competition kicked in. Amazon bought them. Does Amazon have the best worker culture? Well, that's for you to decide. So there is that other issue. Unless you solve what is the equilibrium wage at the lower level for a worker, because all this is not additional. It cannot be. There's no free lunch. And that's something that's often missing from these conversations. We'll give people equity. Yeah, but they need a risk premium. And
That's also why the data is so important,
Yeah.
because, fundamentally, we believe that, and we've seen the business case and data from other companies, which shows that some of the things that we're doing, and you probably have much more recent data about this, that a lot of these things pay for themselves, right? So, you get worried, we're going to increase living wage, how is it, we're not going to be competitive, or the job, we're going to have an unintended consequence that the company is going to move the jobs from this location offshore or to another state. So it's absolutely critical to be able to link whatever you do to improve worker conditions to what the financial outcome is, even if a lot of reasons why we're doing it is we think it's the right thing to do. But you need those extra data points to be able to prove to yourself, the companies, your shareholders, that this is paying for itself.
And just to be clear, investing in workers in a vacuum isn't going to translate to improved financial results. There are operational choices that have to be made to coincide with that greater investment in workers where, there's going to be higher expectation of workers, but that's going to help you ultimately win and achieve those goals. So, I think what gets lost in the conversation around living wage, around what workers are being compensated, is what are the operational choices that companies are making in the way that they are leveraging their workforce to achieve their objectives. And I would argue, and I think there is research to back this up, particularly from the Good Job Strategy from Zeynep Ton at MIT, that there are plenty of companies out there who just don't have great operations, and they bank on really high levels of turnover and keeping wages really low, and that's essentially how they try to meet their objectives. Whereas you have Costco's and other companies who are really committed to succeeding with their workers, and they're making clear operational choices in ways to invest in those workers and get better productivity out of them to make those greater investments worth their while.
Thanks. This is that's really helpful. All really helpful reflections. And Dan, I want to make sure that we get to you on this question. Questions around living wage, around corporate culture, the culture for workers, as well as this emerging interest in worker ownership. Curious about your thoughts on these topics.
Yeah, I think I go back to the Zeynep Ton book too. We have a colleague in common, David Wood, and he summed her book up by saying, she goes into case studies where, companies are leaving money on the table by not paying their workers a living wage. The bad job strategy also works, and it goes back to that decision making as well. But my kind of fallback here is this is happening now in the private sector. There's a level of organizing and people being fed up with not being paid what they're worth. So, and how do we know what workers want? Well, they can express it through collective bargaining, right? This is what UAW just did at the big three auto companies, but now with the non-union auto companies, they're raising wages because they know UAW is going to go organize those workers as well. So I think that this is happening. It's a question of, do we get ahead of it, or is it imposed on us as well? And thinking about your colleague at Columbia, Joe Stiglitz, I think he pointed out that if inequality is a systemic risk, he puts deunionization as about 25% of the rise in inequality. So, I had the benefit 2 years ago of working in the administration for the vice president, and she chairs a task force on worker organizing and empowerment. One of the work products of that task force was a Treasury report that just came out about the benefits of unionization to the economy. But I remember showing her in our first meeting the inverse relationship between union density and the share of income going to the top 15%, and it's a mirror of itself. So, if we're all long-term as asset owners, long-term patient capital, we can only survive in an economy that has this level of inequality and wage stagnation for so long before, someone like Ray Dalio points us out, before inequality comes back to bite us in very harmful ways.
Thanks. Well, we have a little less than 10 minutes left, and I see one question right in front of me. So can I just hand you my mic?
Thanks so much for the panel, Aaron Smith. I have a question. I think today's conversation focused a lot on wage and price, right? And when you think about people as assets, oftentimes companies compete on price and culture. And I know, Dan, you did talk about culture when you mentioned the women's and 50% diversity and the changes that you've seen. So data points on culture. I'd be really curious to hear from the panelists around how you think culture plays a role, because what I've seen is oftentimes people will leave a company for money and they'll leave immediately again because the culture doesn't align with their morals, their values. And so I'd really like to hear from the panelists on that point, data around culture. Thank you.
Let's start.
Well, I can give you a quick one. So I think culture is the biggest off-balance sheet asset a company has. It's super important. Just because we don't know how to measure it, we actually undervalue it. There's not much rigor around that issue. It's like pornography. You know it when you see it, kind of thing, but you can't really define it. What can I say? It's like, you're right. It's actually a wage substitute. People will happily work for a good place where I actually feel like going to work, and I'm happy to take a 20% pay cut, for sure.
I actually do think it's possible to measure culture, maybe not with a direct metric, that is the culture metric, but through different proxies. If you have really high levels of turnover, there's probably something wrong with your culture. At HCAP, we administer an annual employee engagement survey where we are trying to kind of surface worker voice on what is their view of the workplace, and asks a whole range of questions that really leverages the academic research around kind of different job stressors and how does that affect someone's perception of the quality of their job, and ultimately ties back to kind of different business KPIs. So we're able to look at a whole host of questions and understand, are we seeing changes in that company from a culture perspective as we are doing the work to be enhancing workplace practices, to be putting in place more kind of inclusive practices within the workplace. So I think it's something we can get at, but admittedly there's not like one culture metric that folks kind of hang their hat on.
Well, Glassdoor and LinkedIn are not bad ideas. I mean, it's not best. It's the net promoter score on LinkedIn. Sorry, Glassdoor, right? Glassdoor.
Yeah, Kester.
It's not bad. It's reasonable.
And I will say there are a couple of smaller PE firms, one called Blue Wolf, the other called KPS, that have taken a different approach to labor than most PE firms, where they view labor as a partner, as someone to go in with and at the outset figure out productivity goals, workforce reductions necessarily, but viewing the union as a vehicle for not just worker voice, but real partnership and ownership in the company as well. So I think part of the organizing principle of the labor principles is how do we elevate that across a wider set of PE firms as well, in terms of how workers organizing, unions, and labor principles are viewed also. So I think that's part of the culture, as well as employee voice and agency and how that's responded to by the C-suite.
Other questions? I have another question, if nobody in the audience has a question. On other panels earlier today, we heard about target setting and impact-linked compensation. And so when we think about social issues, what are some targets? Maybe these are questions to start with Diana and Tom, that you're using or thinking about. And Dan and Shiva, if you have any thoughts or recommendations as well, feel free to jump in.
Well, I think, and it sort of goes back to culture a little bit, because there is no perfect measurement, but I think, one of the things that we've taken away from this recent learning journey is how do you make the employee engagement survey and the employee engagement objective, in terms of people really feeling committed and engaged in the work that they're doing, a strategic pillar of a company, right? Because I think a lot of times, even you use the employee engagement survey, you kind of get it once a year, you look at it, you make a few tweaks here and there, but you don't necessarily run your company or focus your company around the findings of what you learn from the workforce. So, and then to take it a step further, again, this is kind of like by department, what are the recommendations, and making sure that you are that you're responding to the workers, but that the engagement score by department then becomes the change in the workforce engagement year to year factors into that manager's compensation. So I think there are ways to, tighten up the connection between how people feel in, working for the company and how people are compensated and how strategy is developed. And I think, ultimately, we're trying to get to how do you create a culture of ownership in a company, right? Equity participation is part of it, but those are the kinds of things, that's kind of like the culture we're trying to figure out how to build. We don't have all of the data metrics figured out, but that's kind of our guiding principle now.
And I'll just say quickly, we take target setting and goal setting really seriously at HCAP with all of our portfolio companies. So as a condition of investment close, we will identify a series of goals in partnership with the portfolio company that we want to achieve over the investment period around ways to improve job quality. So these goals are something that we're using as an engagement tool as we're meeting with our portfolio companies quarterly to have a conversation around how's it going with implementation and what supports can we be providing as HCAP to help you make progress towards those goals. So for us, goals help kind of get that alignment out of the way, and it's also a really important communication tool for us in terms of showing that as an impact investor, we really are serious about achieving these job quality improvements with you as a company.
And I imagine that when you're incentivizing management to focus on these issues, it's important to not just focus on the C-suite and executive management, but also middle management as well, to make sure that this culture of ownership is cascading down through the company to every level of worker.
All right, I think we're gonna call it there. But thank you so much, Delilah, Dan, Diana, Shiva, and Tom. Please give them a warm round of applause.